My name is Chris Ricio. I'm with Inflow Communications. We want to thank those of you who arrived early for our session. And as you know, for those of you that do know Inflow, we pride ourselves on providing educational webinars to our clients and anyone that's interested in knowing. And our educational webinars extend beyond the product, but today we're going to be talking about Enterprise Contact Center. Our next training session will be on Tuesday, November 1st at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, and it will be based on ShoreTel PBX user training. All right, so let me tell you about who we are and who is Inflow Communications. My name is Chris Ricio. I'm the Director of Contact Center and Advanced Applications here at Inflow. I come with 20+ years of contact center consulting, engineering, and design. And then along with me for the ride today is Brendan Polk, who comes from our marketing and operations group. And Brendan has 8+ years of web development and marketing. And Brendan, do you want to say hi?
Hey, good morning, everyone.
Thanks, Brendan. And for today's session, Brendan will be our moderator. He'll be stopping, or at least I'll stop for questions, and he'll be addressing any questions that you might have. As always, we want to keep this interactive, and what we'd like you to do is in the right-hand side of your window or wherever you may have your control center, open up the chat window. And when you have questions, pop your questions into the chat window. I'll check in with Brendan periodically to see if there's any questions that we need to address. Now, with that being said, we're going to dive right in. Today's topic is dense, so we've got quite a bit of information to cover. So let's get rolling. Who is Inflow Communications? I'm going to give you a top-down look at Inflow Communications. We've been named as Oregon's top fastest-growing private companies I think this is 4 years in a row now. Also, we are one of ShoreTel's top partners, and we were named ShoreTel Contact Center Partner of the Year in 2015. We were also in the top 3 Excellence Award winner of ShoreTel, which is the ShoreTel Circle of Excellence. Currently today, we support over 100,000 endpoints in service with over 600 customers worldwide. We have offices and employees in Oregon, Washington, California, Texas, and Florida. We're basically all over the place supporting our clients internationally and nationally. We have a team of over 25 skilled professionals, and down below you'll see a list of some of our clients that we support today. And we're doing a lot of work with these clients. Many of them were heavily into the contact center, helping them strategize their contact center operations, with recommendations on product, and more importantly, how to use the products. I think that's the one key element with regard to training. It's not simply just about the software, but how do I put it to practical use? So that's just a smattering of some of our clients down below. One of the things that we have focused and we continue to focus on continually at Inflow is building a knowledge base for clients and anyone that needs to look for information. You'll find on our website that we do have a robust knowledge base complete with videos and downloads. So if you're looking for a particular topic, navigate over to our website and go to our knowledge base. You'll find lots of information, such as today, our session will be recorded, and we'll cut the video into smaller bite-sized chunks so that you can grab information as you need it. One of the things that we've also initiated here at Inflow Communications is our focus on the contact center. Contact center isn't what it used to be, and it's a much more progressive environment. And actually, in contact center itself and where the industry has been over the last several years, there's a strong focus on contact center. And one of the things that we offer is consulting and training. And we talk about contact center consulting and training. We do this through our Contact Center Success Manager program, otherwise known as CCSM for short. Our goal is to provide product insight and operational value in helping our clients really leverage the products they have, but we also work with them as a consultant as part of what we offer to help them strategize their business, develop best practices, and general overall education about contact center, which is often about education around the business of the contact center, not necessarily the products that are in use, but we do that as well. Through our Contact Center Success Manager program, what we look to do is to provide product knowledge. I think one of the important things about product knowledge is application nuances. As you'll see today when we get into the meat of our topic today, the application nuances are often critical in the operation. So we look to extend what is offered in the manual and kind of get to the practical application pieces and sort of cut to the chase. Oftentimes we find nuances in the application are not found in a manual, but as a customer you learn things differently and you see things more often than probably the actual manufacturer does. We also look to utilize the product through your operation, through operational positioning, finding the best ways for you to leverage the tools of your product that is offered, and you'll see some of that today, as well as supporting the customer with best practices, industry knowledge, and industry trends. We take a full holistic approach to the contact center education with our clients, from products, services, and the business itself. Our goal is to give you complete contact center support and education. Now, we call this bridging the gap. My experience in contact center over 20 years that I've had is that oftentimes through the many products that I've seen is that there's always a gap in terms of utilization and how you use the product. And that's what our contact center success manager program is all about, helping fill the gap so you can get the most impact out of the software that you already own or already have. And again, we do that through product know-how, industry knowledge, operational positioning, and contact center classrooms is also what we offer. Now, this is not what we would consider traditional classroom training, such as how do I use the product, which is what you'll see today, but more in lines with focused on users in terms of boot camps, giving IT administrators the know-how so they can help support their internal customer, the contact center. So we have a boot camp which is about aligning IT to help make better configuration choices and to help them respond to their internal clients. We also have a supervisor boot camp, which is about helping new supervisors and managers really understand what their role is in the contact center, as well as an agent boot camp, giving them information about how they understand their role in terms of customer service. And this is one of my favorites. How to use the IVR and leverage big data. Now, big data, I'm just going to say data in general, has been around for years. I've been using it for years, but over the last 10 years, you've seen an accelerated rate of how data is used with the onset of Google. People now understand how valuable data is. IVR is an integral part of that, and it definitely gives you a hedge up on the contact center. So data and IVR is a big topic I love to discuss. And lastly, we also offer creating a culture of success. How do you build a culture of contact center? And it extends beyond the contact center walls into other departments and a strategy from the top down. So we like to create and help clients foster a culture of agent engagement, which is really about creating a fun and engaging workspace for the contact center with strategies for growth, feedback programs, agent recognition programs, creating career opportunities, knowledge enhancement, and generally the overall success of the contact center. So with that being said, our topic today is really Enterprise Contact Center, specifically ShoreTel Enterprise Contact Center. And this is a broad sweeping topic today, and it's with regard to IRNs, services, and groups. Basically, the tenets of queuing and routing and understanding how all the pieces fit together. Let's talk about what our agenda is today. We're going to be covering IRNs, services, groups, and all the associated tasks with that. With IRNs, these are intelligent routing numbers. We're going to talk about route points, IRN, DNSs. They're all the same essentially, but we're going to talk about the differences, and we're going to talk about IRN parameters. This is an important concept to understand because you can benefit from a configuration options, and setting these parameters give you a little bit more leverage in terms of control. And then I love to include things not found in the manual, and you only get this sort of experience from using the product day to day, and we use the product day to day here at Inflow, but if you're a customer, you'll understand this as well. We're also going to cover services. This is where queuing takes place, and yes, there are service parameters that we'll look at, but I'll also look at using IVR to extend your options. I am a big fan of finding out what a product does, finding out where the hooks are, and changing the game. And IVR and the way it's built in ShoreTel's ECC gives you lots to play with. If you've been on my sessions before, you know I'm a big fan of IVR and always creating something dynamic, and we'll go into more detail shortly. And then we'll talk about overflow, interflow, and reporting. There is a question that came up this week with a client, and I think it's an important discussion, and it involves overflow and reporting, so we're going to hit on that. And for those of you that are not familiar with the distinction between overflow and interflow, I will define those. And then we'll look at groups, agent routing, and more. Really, you can think of this as agent distribution, how calls are moved to agents and that sort of thing. We'll look at chat options to understand. Now, ECC does provide multimedia, chat, and dial lists along with voice calls is all part of it, but there are a couple of chat options I want to point out. And then we'll look at real-time thresholds, how the configuration inside ECC Director actually is used by a different product. And then lastly, we'll leave it with QA, if you can see there at the bottom there. So let's get started with IRNs. So IRNs, you probably heard the term route points if you're on the PBX and ECC, route points and IRNs and DNIS. Now, if you're a telecom guy, DNIS means one thing to you. And then oftentimes I will hear the term route point. And when someone is saying route point, I know they're more than likely talking about the PBX. When they say IRN, I know they're talking about ECC. However, folks use this interchangeably. Route points often just as a generic term. So when you hear the term route points, it can actually be either the PBX or ECC. Their route points and IRNs are essentially the same. And the DNIS is a little bit different than what you would expect, but I'll give you a little bit more information in a moment. So just to make it simple, an IRN is an entry point into ECC. On the PBX, you have a route point. On ECC, the route point is called an IRN. They serve the same purpose. It's a routing mechanism. It's a way to intercept a call and take it to a destination. But PBX, route points, and IRNs have the same number. So if you have a route point on your PBX and it's route point 5000, in order for the PBX to be able to negotiate the route over to ECC, it also has to have the same IRN or route point on ECC of 5000. That's how it identifies where it's going. So the route point is the IRN, is the DNIS. Now, we're going to talk about DNIS here because DNIS, if you're a telco person, and I come from the telecom side, I was a telecom engineer for quite a while, DNIS to me meant one thing. DNIS was the numbers coming from the telco or the central office that were passed along as part of a toll-free number typically, but DNIS in the terms of ECC is the IRN. It's the name given to that IRN, and this is helpful for reporting. The name is what will pop up in ECC reports. So just know that there's a close relationship, but the point I want to make here is that when you go to ECC and you see a DNIS, do not expect to see the number that you normally would see passing from telco. For those of you not familiar with telco, let's say I have a number 1-800-555-1212. Oftentimes, telco will pass the last 4 digits. In that example, it's 1212. That number necessarily will not be passed to ECC. The PBX has what's known as a DNIS map, and you can change that number to whatever you'd like it to be or a name, and that's what translates over to ECC. So DNIS is a little bit different than what you would expect, but there are ways to get around that and to provide something more meaningful, such as the fully qualified 1-800-555-1212. Also, the IRN is actually an extension. So you can call an IRN. It's just like a phone extension. And I point this out because when I'm trying to test a new call flow or an IVR flow process, I will take an IRN and point it to the script flow, the IVR script process, so I can test it. So it's a great way for you to do that internally. I've seen some clients associate a DID and they call the number over and over, and I point out, well, you can just call the extension internally just to kind of get to where you're going. So I wanted to point that out. So let's talk about some IRN parameters. These are parameters that you can set to define information associated with an IRN, and usually this information is used for call routing purposes. Now what I'm going to point out is there are a couple things that aren't listed in a manual anywhere, so I'm going to give you a little bit more information. But one of the things you can do is set the call profile value. Now, for those of you not familiar with the call profile, to make it simple, it's any associated data about the call. Most people think of data about the call such as caller ID, the time the call came in, or the queue that that call was bound for. Those are all known as call profiles inside ShoreTel, and call profiles are mandatory or custom. Now, mandatory would be the ones that are already included as part of system parameters. That might be easier for the technical guys to kind of latch onto it that way. But one of the great things about ECC is the ability to create your custom call profile. So you can set a call profile value so that if a call comes in to an IRN, you could associate the business name with that IRN, such as customer service XYZ company. Just a way I want to point out here that this is what you can do with that parameter. You can also set priority values. This is helpful when you have 3 or 4 IRNs that may represent 3 or 4 different business units, but you want different business units handled at a higher priority, such as inbound calls with someone that has an open trouble ticket that's at a high risk, or a sales IRN. Calls coming into sales can be routed at a higher priority than calls for general customer service. So you can set the priority value. You can also set the skill. This skill it basically sets up the requirements for an agent to handle this type of call. The common example I get in tech support is very easy. Let's say you have a new rep, they're in tech support. It's very common for new reps in tech support to be assigned the task of resetting passwords. If you choose a separate IRN and you set a skill for those calls coming into a separate IRN for just password resets, you can set skills to an agent that says only agents that have this skill will be presented this call. So it's a great way to really distill down who should be handling those calls, and this is how you set up that initial rule. It's basically a requirement. Now the destination for IRNs can vary. They can be a device, meaning an extension. They can be a service. We're going to talk about services in a moment, but a service is really a queue. You can have the destination be a script, a group, or an agent queue. Maybe someone presses option 1, it goes to a specified IRN, but only handled by one agent in an agent personal queue. You could do that. IRN, their destination could also be backup points you'll use to target where your backup points are, and secondary server entry points as well. And lastly, when it comes to configurations, I'm a big fan of making things dynamic. Most of the times when you create a configuration, that configuration is just the way it is for the entire day. But with ECC, there's a couple of ways that you can use shifts to alter the destination, so that maybe between 8 a.m. and 12, you hit one group for that IRN. From 12 to 2, it goes to another group, etc. So this is a great way for you to kind of distribute where those calls go and where they land. So that's one way. Obviously through IVR, you can do it through dynamic logic as well. So let's look at this in a little more detail. Now, I've done the print screens, and I'm showing you here that I'm pointing to IRNs inside Contact Center Director, and there are several tabs down below. There's General, Call Profile, DNS, Skills, and Destination. So some of the things I want to highlight here, on the General tab, you'll flag whether to route the call directly to a default destination. What that simply means is that wherever that destination tab is, there you see in the center, is where the call will be flagged. But when you unflag it, you will have the concept of domain routing right below and customer routing. To make it simple, domain routing is a region that you build. Maybe you have a West Coast and East Coast operation, and clients calling from those locations you want routed to that specific domain. The one thing I'll point out, though, is that when you deselect route directly to default destination, then you only have the options for domain routing and customer routing. Now, the system does allow you to create those buckets, the same thing with customers, but here's what I find is problematic. When you choose to route by domain or customer routing, you spend an inordinate amount of time on the administration side. You have to add new area codes, move them around based on your geographical locations, and I just find that to be a cumbersome manual way to do that. I would normally do that sort of processing in the IVR through a database hit, because that's much more flexible, and it's on the fly, and it's just basically one place to administer. It's not two or more places to administer. So that's my cautionary tale there. You'll notice down below there's the callback section. You can also set different caller IDs for callback, and as I mentioned earlier, you can see the redundancy down below. You can set the IRN on a secondary server and synchronize with the primary, etc. So those are some of the options there. Now, when we go a little further, call profile. The call profile, again, is information about the call, whether it's system generated or custom. Now, these call profiles I'm pointing to, these are custom. These are call profiles that I've created, and in ECC, one of the great things about it is that you can give it any name you want. That makes it very logical for the user. So if I need account balance or something different, it also makes it very friendly for each type of vertical. So healthcare would call it something completely different. They might have patient ID. Tech support might have ticket ID, customer ID. So these are very flexible. What I want you to notice is that right there where it says call profile, you'll see right about in the middle of the screen where it's slightly grayed out, there's a value there. So this is what I meant by a parameter. Let's say you have an 800 number pointed to a specific business unit. You could flag the business name with a value, such as buymystuff.com. Here's what I'll point out. When you initiate and update the call profile here, it doesn't always stick when it comes to cradle-to-grave reporting. So my default decision in how to configure something is, where am I going to configure it so I am absolutely certain that data is captured? I have seen this call profile value drop through the process of IVR, even though it's been configured. So as a general rule of thumb, when I want to call out a specific data attribute, I will not use this setting here, but rather go directly to a script that updates the call profile value, because in my case, and the reason for doing that is the most important piece is to capture the data. I think one of the biggest things that people forget in contact center is that it ultimately comes down to, where's the data going to live and what do I need to do to report on it. So that's my tail there. You can certainly set them here. I always reset them inside the script. In fact, I bypass this here, quite honestly. You'll also notice right above the value, there's a priority setting, so you can set the priority as it comes in. Keeping in mind that there is a system parameter inside ECC Director, which I won't show you today, but it allows you to set the default increments as to how often those parameters will update. So if you start out with a priority of 10, you could increment by 5 and say every 30 seconds. Then it goes 5, 10, 15, 20, 12, 30. You get the idea there. Now the DNIS here. This is the DNIS name I was talking about earlier. You see right there in the center where it says DNIS Demo 1? This is the name that you're going to give it. You can give it a logical name, and this will help you with reporting. So oftentimes for the contact center user, the supervisor, they don't know what a number is. So here IRN 500 means nothing to them. But if it said customer service, it might be more appropriate, and that gives them a level of reporting that's easier for them to understand. Now you'll notice your target ASA, which is your average speed of answer, that parameter is set here. Mine is currently set for 20 seconds. You've got short call thresholds. I'm pointing these out because the short call threshold is what the system will use for historical reporting in terms of what to consider a short call and long call. And oftentimes, as the case in contact center, short calls are disregarded because it's typically a client that started the dial process, and maybe by the time it rang once, they hung up, but the system connected. You also have max ACD talk time and interval time. Now this interval time here directly relates to how this information will be showing up in real time. So it's going to be in 30-minute increments. And down below is a service time interval. This allows you to track where calls are being abandoned or answered in segments. So this is 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. Oftentimes, it's critical to understand where the abandon or the answer is happening to help you kind of make decisions about configuration and options. The next option here is skills. This is where I would add a skill, and I can give it a value here. So this is sort of one and the same. And lastly, one and the same, very similar to call profile was my point. Lastly, the destination tab, you can see that the type I'm pointing to as a script. You can certainly point the type to a device, to a script, to a service, to a group. It's up to you how you want that to happen. What I'll point out below is you see where it says shifts. This is what I was talking about. You can create shifts that will change the destination throughout the course of the day. And this is common when you have different groups expand and contract throughout the day. Depending on your operation, your evening groups may be a little bit different than your daytime groups. So don't forget about the flexibility here. It's usually not just how you set it. In terms of the base configuration, you can always override with shifts. And one of my favorite ways to override anything is using IVR. Now I'm going to show you, give you some hidden gems that are not found in the manual. These are things that we've learned through usually pain, so I want to share them with you now. Now I already shared this one. The default call profile values do not always stick in CCIR, which is cradle to grave reporting. So if you assign that at the IRN, you may not see it translate all the way to cradle to grave. So if you're looking for heavy analytics and you need that information, I would update it rather in IRN, but inside IVR. Skills need to be moved into CCIR for reporting purposes, meaning you have to move the skill over into the repository so that the cradle to grave knows you want to track this. This is also true for custom call profiles. We're going to see that in a minute. But by default, the only processes that are going to show up in cradle to grave recording are the system parameters. You need to move over other parameters that you have. Calls transferred between IRNs will reset call profile values, priorities, and skills. This one was a painful one to learn, but if you go from one IRN to another, let's say you're queuing in one IRN, and then you decide you want to point it to another destination IRN, you're going to lose some critical data. So that's not always your best way to move calls about. I would recommend moving them about through services or groups. That way you retain that data. So that's an important one that I learned the hard way. And lastly, the DNS reports are the IRN reports. Now, truthfully, this is in the manual, but I wanted to make it very explicit here because it's not explicitly stated, and there seems to be a lot of confusion with that reporting. So let's take a look at what I meant by moving the data over so it shows up in CCIR. Now, I know this is small. On the upper left-hand side, I've navigated inside Director, ECC Director, to CCIR. And you can see down below, I've got mandatory call reporting, mandatory call profile fields in the middle there. And then down below of that is the call profiles that I've created. So there is a distinction. In the center, you see the arrows here, the single arrow, the multiple arrow. You want to move these values to the right so that CCIR captures it. And this is what I mean by moving the data over. If you don't move the data over, it doesn't catch it by default. You've got to put it in there for cradle to grave purposes. And for those of you that have a heavy analytics group in marketing, this is an important piece not to skip. And here's what I mean here. You see the CCIR down below. I've got the skills as well. One of the items also in here is the skill. So in addition to moving over the call profiles, this is where you want to move the skill. And that's the arrow on the left. You move it to the right. And then lastly, this is a view of the cradle to grave reporting that ShoreTel provides. This is called Interaction Viewer. But what you're doing is you're building the repository, so all that juicy data is right here. And you see right in that red box, in the dark blue header, it says CP values. This is what I'm talking about. So when you're going through, think about the configuration, think about what data you want to capture, and make sure it's there. I've seen a lot of clients have pain over this, and then once we show them what they missed, they have an aha moment. So hopefully this helps you ahead of the game. All right, so we're going to migrate over to services. We're about 30 minutes in, so I'm going to keep track of the time just to make sure. Now, services is a little more dense, so we'll have a few topics here. So because systems are varied and they're different, and we have clients coming from many different applications, different providers, one of the things that they're surprised to figure out is, where does the queuing happen? Most folks think, okay, once I send a call to a group, that's where it's queued. In most cases, in a lot of cases, that's the case. However, with ECC, there's this process called a service. The service is actually the queue. So when you're looking at setting up the configuration, this is where all the queuing takes place. Now, what sets the service aside, and apart from just a general group queue, is that the service can see multiple groups simultaneously. Most systems will go to group A. 30 seconds later, if the overflow timeout lapses, the call rolls to group B, and the net result is that I no longer have access to group A in that scenario, and that's just too critical for a contact center. I need to be able to see what is going on across those groups, because what happens if an agent becomes available in group A a split second after the overflow timer elapsed? So many of the common queue options are configured here in the service, and I'll show that to you. From greetings, we're going to talk about the greetings and when a call actually lands in queue. In-queue announcements, and we've all heard the people call them comfort messages or in-queue announcements. That's typically, thank you for continuing to hold. Your call is important to us, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so you would configure that there. Now, one of the things I will point out is in the announcements, most systems give you the option of 3 or 4 announcements. With ECC, you can stack the announcements through a clever tool, maybe not so clever, but through IVR. And even though the system allows for 20 different messages, I could have 100 because the IVR lets me completely be dynamic. Nobody would ever have 100, but I'm just kind of giving you the thought process here that think about how can you create a dynamic contact center. We're going to talk about that in a moment. This is where you'll find overflow and interflow timers, callback settings, and other business rules. And again, use shifts to change the destination of the service throughout the day. This is something I love to do. So let's take a look at this in more detail. There's a lot of information here. So in your ECC directory, you're going to go to Services, and you'll notice in the center here, I have a General tab. There's several tabs here. So I'm going to breeze through these in the amount of time we have. Again, if you have questions, pop them into your chat window on the right, or if you need to do a one-on-one because you might have a lengthy discussion, I'm happy to do the discussion one-on-one, reach out to Susan. So generally speaking, on the general tab, you'll have things like agent selection or how we distribute the call to agents. And I'm going to go through these. These are most common. You have longest idle, terminal, circular. I'll explain these in a moment. And then you have best skill fit. You'll notice under best skill fit, you also have 3 other options. That is because it's very common for agents to possess the same skill proficiency, so you need a tiebreaker, and that's what that is. Down below that, you can enable chat. Down below, you see where it says capabilities, chat. You can enable chat options there, and then you have your timers for wrap up and forced release down below. Now, wrap up is the time. You might know it as after call work if you're on a different system, but that's where you set it here. And the forced release in timeout is when a call is presented to an agent. They don't answer a call in a certain amount of time, it rolls to the next agent. They will be put in forced release, meaning the system says, I'm going to make them unavailable to the queue because I tried to send a call to them and I don't want to do that again if they're not at their desk. Now, most clients have a love-hate relationship with the forced release timeout. So there's kind of a gotcha there. If you extend the forced release to 40 seconds, that means the caller will ring at the agent's desk for 40 seconds. You don't want to do that. It's one of those options that I wish had more flexibility. I'll just point that out. So in terms of queue distribution, the service defines parameters and how interactions are distributed. So you have longest idle, terminal, circular. And I'm going to define these in a moment. Then you have best skill fit, and then you have the tiebreakers. So let's look at these here. Here's where you have the agent selection, longest idle. Let's talk about how I set these parameters. Longest idle basically means assigned to the agent that has been idle the longest. Terminal, most think of terminal as top down. If you have 5 agents, count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and always go in that order. However, terminal is assigned to the first available agent in the order the agent is listed in their groups. So you can change the order in the group. We used to do this in sales environment that I was a part of many years ago. The agent that sold the most timeshares would be top gun, and they get pushed to the top of the group and always got the first opportunity for a call. Now, circular, this is an interesting one. Most folks think of circular as round robin. It's not quite the same. Round robin typically says, deliver my calls to agent 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then on the next pass, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1. And then 3, 4, 5, 1, 2. Now, circular in ECC is there's a slight adjustment. It starts with the last agent that received a call and assigns the next available agent. So it's always trying to equally balance calls across agents. Very much like round robin, but a slight little twist there. So wanted to make sure I point that out. Best skill fit is when it matches the proficiency level, and then if you have 2 agents that have the same skill parameters, there's a tiebreaker, longest idle, terminal, and circular. So you have options. You're never really stuck. So here's where all the options are enabled for announcements. Let's talk about announcements. Now, announcements, as you would know, when a call hits a queue, you typically get the greeting. There are some greetings that are mandatory, or that in your company you might require them to be mandatory for compliance reasons, such as, thank you for calling Inflow Communications. Your call may be monitored for quality assurance purposes. Anytime you need to have a recording without fail played, you're going to enable the first arrow at the top there, which is the mandatory announcement. So I'm going to tell you a fact about mandatory announcements in a moment. After the mandatory announcement, there is the first announcement. So once I'm going to call it the mini Miranda about call recording is announced, you're going to have a first announcement, and you have a timeout parameter. Maybe 10 seconds later, you have, thank you for calling. Your call is important to us. Please continue to hold. But then you see the next one where it has secondary announcement settings, and then the last arrow down below. This is where you can stack multiple announcements. Now, rather than stack multiple announcements, I'm a big fan of using IVR to decide what the announcement will be. Because if I use IVR, I can get very specific, because the IVR can say things like, is this a VIP customer? The answer is yes. Play this message, which is a celebrity endorsement. Play this marketing path, and then go back to the queue. If it's a different client, you can play different messages. So I like to use IVR to mix it up. But the third arrow down you see is this is just a cycle. How do you want to cycle through those stack of announcements? Cycle them all, cycle just the last one, or no cycle. So it's up to you. But my favorite way to do it is by using IVR, because all these announcements are using IVR anyway to play the greeting. So I always think, how can I make it more dynamic? How can I make it more of a customized experience for my customer or the caller? Here's what I'll say about services. Remember this. A call is not considered in queue until after the mandatory announcement has played. This is an important one to remember, because one of the things that you can do with IVR is make a decision whether or not to queue the call or offer a callback in queue based on wait time. Now, here's what I had a client attempt to do at one point. In the mandatory announcement, the first thing they wanted to do was check to see the place in queue or the average wait time. And based on the average wait time or in queue, then decide whether or not to immediately answer them with a "we're very busy today" message and offer a callback in queue. The only problem with that is it never triggered true because the call had never entered the queue. The mandatory greeting is only used when you want to do things such as play a greeting. It's kind of simple. If you want to do extended logic, then what I would recommend is that play the mandatory greeting, then use your first announcement 2 seconds later to automatically offer another greeting if you want to do callback in queue. I'm sorry, call times today are beyond 5 minutes. If you'd like a callback in queue, press 1, that sort of thing. So this is a key point to remember. The call is not considered queued until after the mandatory announcement. So this removes any of the concerns about your initial announcement is 15 seconds long or 30 seconds long and it's counting against your queue time. It is not. So the announcements here, I talked about the cycling, the last one, but here's what I like to do. I like to use IVR script logic to make announcements dynamic, and I gave you some examples of that just a moment ago for customer type. For VIP, if I can use a script to decide, is this my VIP customer? Play something different. What's the queue time? How long has this VIP customer been in queue? Because I'm going to treat them differently than other clients. Priority escalation. Hey, this is a technical support issue with a class 4 outage. I need them to be bounced at the top of the queue. Things of this nature. It's really about branding the experience. So in any case that I work with clients, I'm always looking for what is special about your customers, your customer base, but also each individual customer. So some customers are VIP customers, some customers are generic customers, and if you need to treat them differently, you have a great way to do this. So I really like to look at the IVR and see how can we impact that experience, because not only is it going to help you streamline and create business logic outside of the queue, it gives you a little bit more control over that customer journey. And there's a lot of attention now on the customer journey and what's happening with those customers. So that's how I use IVR to play announcements within services, because I can do a lot more with it. Now there's a destination type. As I said, destination types can be a group, it can be a service, but you'll notice there next to that top arrow, right off to the left, in light gray, agent queue. One of the processes that you can create in ECC is an agent queue. This is a queue just for one agent. So I can direct calls directly to an agent. You'll notice down below I have shifts. Again, you might want to use shifts to decide where the calls go throughout the day versus keeping it static throughout the day. So it's just another option that gives you more flexibility. The overflow timer. Now the overflow timer, this is pretty straightforward. You're going to set your timeout parameters. And we're going to talk about what happens when a call overflows and how does it report. I think it's an important piece and it came up. But here I can stack overflow groups. And I can have multiple groups here. Keeping in mind that the overflow isn't just passing to the next group, it's actually what I call casting the net further. So if I have 5 groups and the call starts in group A, 30 seconds later it's looking at group A and B. 30 seconds later, this group is looking at A, B, and C, and so on. I call that casting the net further. The services give you that luxury, and calls then become queued simultaneously for multiple groups. Now, here's what I'll say about overflow. When a call in queue surpasses the overflow timer, the service will queue the call for the next group or groups that you have configured. The call is simultaneously in both queues. So it's a tremendous advantage, but here's what you need to know. If the originating group frees up an agent and answers it, meaning we're at 30 seconds, now I'm looking at groups A and B, and all of a sudden an agent in group A became available before somebody in group B, the call will count as a call accepted and answered by another group against the overflow group and will show as overflowed and answered against the primary group. So there's two pieces here. Yes, we hit the timer for overflow, so it's going to show as an overflowed call, but on the overflow group who was bound for that call, it's going to show as answered by another group. So that's an interesting question that came up from a customer of mine. I wanted to point this out, keeping in mind that calls are queued simultaneously when you're using overflow, and it's a tremendous advantage. So don't let the reporting piece scare you away. It's actually a great service for your clients. So when you look at overflow, think about overflow shifts. And you can see that at the top arrow is showing overflow shifts. Again, shifts can define. You can have overflow to any process. Typically in the evening, overflow might happen for a delivery stockroom. It might go to somebody else at the front desk versus dispatch. So you have different options there. And down below, you also have overflow shift agent queues. So maybe during the day it overflows to a primary group, but in the evening it goes to an agent queue who actually acts as simultaneously a receptionist. So think about your options, think about how you can maneuver through the system. Now interflow. Interflow is when a call leaves the ACD. Basically anytime it leaves ECC. And this is, again, you can use shifts, you can have default destination, just be creative where you want that to go. And you have a timeout parameter at the top. Now you have a button or a checkbox at the very top, right above where it says timeout predictive interflow. The tenets of predictive interflow are to be, if this parameter or if this option is selected, rather than making a client wait in queue for 30 seconds, the predictive interflow will allow you to say, well, trump the 30 seconds and instead go to IVR and find out what the average queue time is and then make an immediate determination to make it happen. Now, here's what I'll point out. The way ECC and IVR calculate the queue time, this is not always a definitive marker. In fact, most clients just opt not to use this because it becomes cumbersome and tricky because the math doesn't calculate the way you would expect. It's a little more rigid than I believe it should be. I've yet to see a client actually use this successfully. So that's just my caveat in my experience. If there's anyone in this call that has used it, let me know. I would love to be educated. So just to make the point clear, interflow is when a call leaves the ACD. The call is said to have interflowed. So it's any destination not on ECC. It could be a PBX extension, an operator, an answering service, a voicemail. And I bring this up because a lot of clients ask me, well, how do I track voicemails? There's a lot of ways that you can strategically label calls through the IVR flow process. And I use the term call profile and label synonymously, because the label just means I can flag any data to that call. But here's the fun thing. When I flag a call with a label, I can use that label to make a determination. And one of the fun things I like to do is use it for reporting purposes. So here, we're looking at the No Agent Destination tab. This is what you're going to set anytime there's no agents logged in. The destination typically here is an after hours message, but you've got to think about your configuration here. Here's what I will tell you. Let's say you have one agent logged in the queue and a call comes in and the agent says, I'm going to let that call roll. And they don't answer the call and the agent's going to go to forced release. Then the agent decides to log out. Well, what happens to that call in queue? The call never gets stuck in queue. As soon as that agent logs out, the call will be moved to this destination because now there's no agent in there. But there's a distinction between how that call is counted. When I log out, it's an interflowed call. In reporting, there are two separate metrics that you're going to look at. There's an interflow, which is a call that landed in queue and then maybe 10 seconds later it went to voicemail. That's interflow. But a call will have been said to be interflowed when an agent is logged in and then logs out. It's going to be pushed to this no agent destination and it'll be counted as an interflow. There's also another metric called calls deflected because no agents weren't logged in. This is a very great way to figure out what actually happened. So if you see an interflowed call and you don't have an interflow timer, I'm going to say the likely culprit is that an agent was logged in and decided not to take the call and just logged out, abandoning the customer. So just know that. Now what I do with no agent destination, because this tends to be a static destination, I prefer to point it to an IVR script and make decisions, and here's why. It's very common in contact centers during the day that maybe you want to, if you're a sales group, you want to have a raw moment, right? Between 3 and 4, we're going to go take everybody off the phones and have a pump up the sales team meeting. You can use the no agent destination with an IVR script that says, okay, if it's Monday through Friday and I'm not logged in and it's not between these hours, play this message. I'm sorry, we're temporarily unavailable. We'll be back on the system momentarily. Or if it's after hours, then go to the after call or after hours messaging. So again, use the IVR to completely break the boundaries of the application, so to speak. Scheduled callbacks. Likewise, you can have a default destination. Here's what I'll say about callbacks. In the context of ECC, callbacks happen as a scheduled callback, meaning hold my place in queue and call me back, or I don't want to hold in queue. I want you to call me back at 7 p.m. when I'm driving home. So you can do a scheduled callback. Abandoned callbacks work the same way, but here's the one thing you need to know. By default, if you turn it on, callbacks will happen all day long and abandoned callbacks will happen all day long. If your purpose is to only offer and do callbacks during business hours, you've got to create a shift down below from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. That's the only time we do callbacks. Otherwise, you could get a call that slips through the cracks and call after compliance hours. Likewise, if you're an exceptionally busy contact center and you only offer callbacks between 2 and 4, then set your parameters here. If you don't set the schedule or the shifts, you're going to get callbacks defaulted all day. And I've had clients call and say, hey, my callbacks are happening at 6 o'clock in the morning. Set your parameters. So that's just a caveat there. And abandoned callbacks work the same way. You have your destination, you enable it with the checkbox at the top there, which is right there if you can see my cursor. And then down below you have several different options. And one of the things I like to say is when you're doing callbacks, think about the reason for the callback. And I'll make this statement. Callback in queue, which a lot of folks know as concierge or virtual hold, does not solve every problem in a contact center. I did have a customer who was short-staffed and they wanted to deploy callbacks in queue, and as soon as we did that, then no call ever went to the desktop to an agent. They were doing nothing but callbacks, and they were wondering why the system wasn't working. When I logged into their queue, they had 99 callbacks in queue, so that a new caller could not get into the system. They had a staffing issue, and I had to break the bad news to them, but that's just my philosophy on callbacks. It doesn't cure every problem. Where it works best is that when you have a call volume that spikes and peaks and valleys throughout the day sharply, like in the first half hour, then the second half hour not. That's where it's a great gap filler. And lastly, callbacks can be assigned to a separate group. Think about the thought process. If the primary group is too busy to take the call, so we offered a callback, they're likely not going to be able to filter in the callbacks while more calls are still coming in. So use the callbacks and think about when you want the callback to happen. And again, during different times of the day, you can shoot it off to somebody else. Maybe for callbacks, you have a specialized person who is a customer care expert, and that's all they do is handle those callbacks, which sometimes can be a little more heated dialogue. Abandoned callbacks, scheduled callbacks. By default, the system will make abandoned callbacks all day. Use shifts to define the callbacks when they'll be made. Callbacks do not always solve queue problems. So let's talk about groups. I have about 5 more slides, and I believe we'll be done here. I'm going to power through this, and then I'll open up questions. So groups, agent routing, and more is what we're talking about. Obviously, most people know what groups are. They're an operational unit. It's usually set up for the structure of reporting, but agents can be members of multiple groups, and agents can log in and out of individual groups. That's very different than ShoreTel's work groups, which is PBX facing. So they can log in and out of multiple groups or log into more than one group at the same time, which is a great opportunity. Oftentimes you have managers or specialized reps that will be classified as members of all groups, and they can just kind of help out when they need to. And that's very common for supervisors and team leads to do as well. And they can log into all groups simultaneously. Using IVR to extend the service announcements we already talked about, rather than playing the same message over and over in queue, use IVR to get strategic. We talked about the mandatory greetings, overflow greetings, and the distinction between interflow. So I won't belabor the point. Let's look at the groups here, the group setup. Now there's some things here you would want to configure for your groups. Number one, capabilities. With the first arrow in the middle, the small arrow, pointing to chat or dial list. If you want to enable chat and multimedia, it's very simple to do it here. And down below you have your metrics again, like average speed of answer, short call threshold. So all the same things you saw at the IRN level are dictated here as well. This will drive the group reports metrics for service level and TSF. If you're not familiar with TSF, it's the old name for service level. People now call it service level, but TSF. All right. Here, the Agents tab will have all your agents, members of the groups, and there's always more than one way to add agents. You can do them individually as agents, assign groups, or you can go to the group and just drop them in. Now, with the chat, there's a couple of parameters I want to point out. Right in the center there where that arrow is, the top parameter is inactivity timer. If you set this for 10 seconds, the system is going to say, if I'm having a web chat session with the client and there is 10 seconds of no dialogue, they will terminate the chat. Most people don't like to set that. And then there's also a response time threshold. This will change the color to the manager so they can tell, hey, agent, why aren't you responding to the chat? The customer asked you a question. There's also an email subject line, so you can have chats sent to email for cataloging purposes, and then you can see this append call profile. In the subject, you could say email received from, and then you can put call profile account number. It'll show the account number in the title. So it's just another way that the call profiles work towards your benefit. The thresholds tab here, this actually directly sets the yellow and red classification of this tool right here. On the right-hand side is Agent Manager, which is the tool that ECC provides. You see in the center where it's yellow and red. The timers here trigger this. So this is what I meant earlier, that it's a mechanism for setting visual for an external application. Lastly, there's a staffing schedule. I'm going to point this out just because it's there. The way the staffing schedule is supposed to work is that you fill in the parameters of how many agents should be required for a certain shift or schedule. And once you click off the schedule, then after collecting data for a period of time, the report will tell you how many agents over or under based on the activity. Now, this is not a true staffing scheduling workforce management tool. It's simply a way to get around it. Very few clients use it, and then the last time I checked, this service had been deprecated as of ECC 8. So if anyone knows any differently, please let me know. So in summary, IRN is a route point. It's the entry point to ECC. And remember, the route point on the PBX will have the same number as the IRN on ECC. Services is where queuing takes place. So when you think about queuing, don't go to the group for those options. And you think about queuing and announcements, go to your services. Groups define operational units. That's very easy. It's usually set out for reporting purposes. And lastly, shifts to change destinations, use shifts to change destinations throughout the day. Just because you have one configurable option doesn't mean you can't have others. And lastly, my favorite tool is to use IVR to create dynamic decisions about everything from menus, announcements, how you treat callers, priorities. This is where you're going to get the most bang for your buck in really creating a dynamic contact center. Here at Inflow, we work with many of our clients to help them leverage the power of how to use IVR. So I know that last bit was pretty quick. We're right up here, about 4 minutes left. If you have questions or any topics seemed a little green to you, or maybe you didn't quite understand what I was referring to, or you just like to have a one-off discussion about your operation, Susan controls my calendar, so I work with her directly. She would be happy to field any questions you have. She'll set up a meet one-on-one with me, and it's a free session. We do not charge you if you're not a customer. If you're a customer, we'd love to spend time with you. And I wanted to thank everyone for taking time, a full hour out of your day, especially if you're in a busy contact center. I know it's a lot to ask. We hope you've got value out of today. Visit our knowledge base at inflowcommunications.com to pull down any sort of videos and or presentations. By the way, this presentation will be sent in PDF format, so you have all the content here to look at your leisure. And thanks again for your time today, and have a great afternoon.